Hello, marketplace nerds. Welcome to my talk about kickstarting and scaling a marketplace business. So we're going to spend the next half hour talking through a bunch of research that I did about how the biggest marketplace companies got started and scaled. First of all, a little bit about me. I currently spend my time basically writing this newsletter that is very creatively called Lenny's Newsletter. Before that, I spent 7 years at Airbnb. I led supply growth for a couple of years. I led the conversion team for a couple of years. I led the community team and a few other projects. Before that, I had a startup that I sold to Airbnb. And before that, I was an engineer for about 10 years. And the way that I'm going to break up this talk is into two parts. Part one is around cracking the chicken and egg problem. And part two is around scaling your marketplace once you've cracked that problem. And hopefully we have time for that. And if not, I'll go through that as quickly as I can because I want to make sure there's time for Q&A. And what this work is based on is interviews with the founders and early growth leaders at basically the biggest marketplace companies in the world. Where this came from is I worked at Airbnb, and people came asking me about what Airbnb did to become what they are. And I always felt weary giving advice because it was always this one perspective of how one company did things. And so I always had a kind of a selfish desire to learn how other companies approached all the same problems. And so this comes from at least 100 hours of work talking to all these founders and growth leaders about what they did at their companies. And hopefully in the next half hour, you get all of the lessons without having to read all the work that led to this presentation. Quickly, thank you to all these folks that contributed to this work. They basically, all this comes from their insights and stories and lessons. And so big thank you to these folks. And then real quick, just a few pieces of context. I'm going to talk about what is a marketplace, why are they interesting to people, and then just a few disclaimers. What is a marketplace? I imagine most folks here know this already, but the way I think about it is a marketplace business is a business that helps demand, finds supply, and it leads to a financial transaction. So for example, Tinder, not a marketplace because there's no financial transaction, hopefully. And Shopify and Substack, not marketplaces because they don't find demand for supply. Why are marketplace companies interesting? One, they have network effects, which essentially means that any new unit of supply means that the entire network and marketplace is more useful to everybody else involved. And that leads to strong barriers to entry because it's hard to replicate that. And they're also just very efficient, scalable, and flexible because they don't actually have to manage their own inventory and supply. And finally, just a few disclaimers as we go through this. I'm going to talk through a bunch of tactics and strategies that these companies used, but nothing really matters if you don't actually have product market fit. Basically, every company that I talked through here found product market fit pretty early. And so I would prioritize that above all else and don't think that doing some of these things is going to solve product market fit for you. Two, these are all stories of the past of what worked for these companies in the past. Doesn't mean they're going to work in the future. So just keep that in mind. And I would focus on the way they approach their problems and the way they thought about it, not necessarily do X, Y, Z and you're going to grow. And then the last piece is these are all stories from people and, memory is not reliable. So things may not be totally accurate, but I will say that all of these stories and tricks and tactics and strategies, I triangulated them across a bunch of different people at each company. So I feel very good about these being right. And I've also put this content out in the past and nobody has complained about anything being wrong. So I feel good about all of this. So with that, let's talk about phase one. And phase one is around cracking the classic chicken and egg problem that marketplaces face. And what makes this challenging is, unlike most businesses where you're selling something to a customer, marketplaces have two sides and you have to and they're serving each other. And so how do you figure out, how do you bring one side of the marketplace on when the other side isn't there yet? That's classically known as the chicken and egg problem. So as an example, DoorDash, say you're starting DoorDash. Do you try to convince restaurants to come on board first before anybody's actually buying from you or using your app? Or do you try to convince people to download the app before there's any restaurants on the platform. Really hard. And so that's known as the chicken and egg problem. And one of the most interesting takeaways from this work is that there's actually just the same 4 steps that all of these marketplaces went through to crack the chicken and egg problem. They first constrained their marketplace to what I call the minimal viable marketplace. And we're going to dive into each of these step by step. So they first constrained their marketplace, then they concentrated on one side or the other of the marketplace, then they grew their initial supply, and then they grew their initial demand. And what's interesting is basically every company that I talked to did exactly this in this order. And so let's go through these step by step. So the first step is to find a way to constrain your marketplace. And there's essentially 2 ways to do this. You can constrain it around a geo, or you can constrain it around a category. So of the 17 companies that I looked at, here's how they approached it. Most companies constrained around a geo. Those that couldn't generally constrained by category. And then there's one interesting exception of Thumbtack, which did not, and they have their own reasoning for that, which we'll talk about. So let's look at some examples of constraining by geography. Rover, which is a dog boarding and now dog walking marketplace, they constrained their marketplace to Seattle. So they started just in Seattle initially. And as you can see, they kind of found Seattle was an amazing city for their business because it was very dog friendly. There's a lot of tech workers that travel often. Amazon, the biggest employer, is very dog friendly also. And they were able to scale and learn what they should be building quickly, being focused in one city. Instacart, their approach was start with cities where basically winter was coming and people needed their service more than other places. And they kind of went step by step, city by city. And OpenTable found that they needed about 50 to 100 restaurants concentrated in a part of the city to become useful to users. And so similarly, they concentrated on creating that critical mass, one city at a time. Examples of the category constraint. Eventbrite found that they basically focused on mixers and tech events. And it ended up working for them because tech folks ran these events, sent out their invites. Other people in tech got the invites, saw Eventbrite in the email, and signed up and discovered it through that. And it created this kind of quick feedback loop within the specific community. And then TaskRabbit, as you probably know, focused on handyman tasks and IKEA furniture assembly and things like that. And then Thumbtack, kind of the interesting one in this bucket. So the founders knew that they probably should constrain. This is a quote from Sander, one of their founders, that they're like, okay, we should probably constrain by category or geography, but their feeling was because of what Thumbtack offers, which is things like plumbers and electricians and gardeners and things like that, you don't actually use it often. And so their feeling was if we focus on one category or one market, they couldn't get enough usage ongoing for it to work. And so they just kind of brute forced it and launched nationally across every category. And it took a long time for them to get somewhere. And so it's unclear if this was actually a good idea or not looking back, but it worked out for them. So, you know, it's an option. Okay, so you've constrained your marketplace. You figured out how to constrain your marketplace. The next step is you want to figure out which side of the marketplace to focus on and concentrate on. And one of the lessons that I took away from this work is that generally supply is where you want to start. So you'll see here 80% of the companies that I looked at focused on supply and almost exclusively supply early on. For example, Lyft basically found that it was always supply for them, that supply growth unlocked demand from the beginning and ongoing. DoorDash, same thing. They looked at how businesses like theirs grew, and it always started with restaurants, delivery people to customers. And so they focused almost exclusively on supply growth. And then Thumbtack looked at the biggest marketplaces out there when they were starting. And they looked at eBay, Craigslist, and Amazon, and they basically found that all that mattered is supply. Brand and product being ugly didn't matter. As long as they had the supply, people would come. And so that's why they focused on supply. And then there's only a few examples of companies that focus on demand. And this doesn't mean these are the only companies where demand is where you should focus, but the key is why did they end up focusing on demand mostly? And so one reason in the case of Rover is they basically found supply came super easily. And the reason for that is if you think about the value prop to supply on Rover, it's basically watch a dog anytime you want for 50 bucks. It's a pretty good value prop. And so a lot of people signed up, and they had, through their history, it turned out they had no problem acquiring supply. So to them, it was pretty obvious. Supply is not going to be a problem. Let's focus on demand. Yeah, okay, Zillow. So Zillow is a different example. Zillow basically bootstrapped their supply off of public data. They found that they could just get addresses of homes and possibly how much they cost or were sold for, and that became their supply initially. And that brought demand, and then that later brought a different kind of supply where people took ownership of their homes on Zillow. And so the lesson here is that if you can offer your supply easy, flexible work that has meaningful income, then your supply is probably going to come pretty easily. Or if you could bootstrap supply off existing data. Otherwise, you're probably going to want to concentrate on supply. And Patreon is actually a really good example of a company that actually started off being a marketplace and thought they were a marketplace. They thought they were going to connect creators with people that wanted to support creators, but they found that people weren't actually, that wasn't a problem on the demand side. People are not out there looking for creators to pay money to. And so they essentially realized we're not a marketplace, we're a platform, and let's cut off the marketplace side of our roadmap and just focus on becoming the best tool for creators to come to Patreon. And so the lesson here is you may think you're a marketplace, but you may not be. And the way I think about this is there a demand for the supply that you're offering? Are people looking for what you have to sell? Even though supply may want demand, doesn't mean your demand cares about what you got. So that's something to think about. Okay, so step one, constrain the marketplace. Step two, figure out which side of the marketplace to focus on. Step three is even if demand is your biggest constraint, you still need some supply on your shelves. You need something to sell, even at the beginning. So whether you focus on supply exclusively or whether you just get some initial supply always comes first to some degree. So let's talk about growing supply. Okay, so these are the 12 most common early supply growth levers across all of the marketplaces I looked at. And since I don't think we can communicate through this, I usually ask if anyone can guess what the top three are. And so maybe in your mind, guess what the top three early supply growth levers might be for marketplaces. And big reveal, the most common is actually sales, which surprised me. And I'll go through some examples. So sales, just basically going out and finding supply directly, is the most common way to grow your initial supply. Two is piggybacking off an existing network. And then three, referrals. And then the rest are here. And one of the interesting takeaways for me here was that performance marketing and SEO, not common early growth levers for supply, which I have here. So examples of direct sales, OpenTable. Basically, they had people walking door to door from restaurant to restaurant, carrying their like servers and software, showing restaurants what they were offering. Airbnb even had a pretty serious early, direct sales force early on. A lot of basically operations people in markets calling and emailing potential hosts to get them onto Airbnb, and then they help them onboard. Piggybacking, the second most common lever. Basically, everyone piggybacked off Craigslist is the bottom line. And I think it continues to this day. So the question here is there a network where your existing supply happens to be living and selling? And how do you funnel them off to your platform? Referrals was a really successful early growth lever for a lot of companies. So Lyft, it was double digits of their new supply. At Uber is about a third of their first trips came from supply that came through a referral. And then Caviar, similarly. So 5 of the 17 companies I looked at, referrals were one of their biggest growth levers. word of mouth was actually the fourth. It's kind of a, not necessarily a lever, but it's an interesting thing to track how much organic growth you're getting. And so with OpenTable, they found that restaurant owners were close with other restaurant owners, and they talked and they shared that, hey, you should check out this OpenTable thing. It's pretty great. Patreon, same thing. A lot of creators know each other. And so one creator gets onto Patreon, tells the other creators about Patreon, they sign up. And then Eventbrite in their IPO filing actually shared that about a third of their supply growth is word of mouth. The fifth most common lever is subsidizing. If Lyft and Uber are famous for this, they basically pay their drivers a salary or a minimum salary until they had enough demand to create enough supply early on. And then Breather, which is a on-demand meeting and kind of like a meeting room marketplace, they rented rooms and then they just made them really nice. So they subsidized the quality of their supply. And then a surprise to me is that there's this kind of concept of a single player mode on the supply side of marketplaces where you create value for just one side of the marketplace, in this case, supply. So how do you make supply happy without any demand? OpenTable is famous for this, where they created basically a nice booking system for restaurants where they just used OpenTable to accept bookings without any promise of customers coming through OpenTable. And that onboarded a ton of supply. And then later, once they had enough supply, they could go out to customers and tell them there's this amazing way to book restaurants. And so, yeah, what's interesting here is not a lot of companies actually use this. I thought it was going to be a lot more. So, okay, so another lesson actually is focus. If you look at the median number of levers that worked for all of these companies, there's actually only 2. So the lesson here is don't try to do them all. Find the 2 or 3 that are going to be most impactful for your type of company, and then just focus heavily on those things. Okay, so we've constrained the marketplace. We've figured out which side of the marketplace to focus on. We've now started to figure out supply, and now we want to focus on demand. So again, here are the 12 most common growth levers for early demand growth at all these marketplaces. And again, the first 3 are covered up. So see if you can guess in your mind's eye what the top 3 are. The answer is word of mouth happens to be the most common demand side growth lever, which to me just kind of tells me again that product market fit was really important for all these companies. They basically found something people really needed, and it was an amazing experience. And so their customers started talking about them and sharing it with their friends. And then the second most common lever, super interesting, essentially supply in the marketplace drove their demand. And I'll go through some examples of that. And then SEO ended up being the third most common lever, unlike on the supply side. And performance marketing was the fourth most common, again, unlike on the supply side. So, word of mouth, examples of word of mouth for these marketplaces, the most common way that they grew demand. For Lyft, it was huge. They had the pink mustache, and that helped accelerate that kind of thing. At OpenTable, again, they found that word of mouth was really big for them early on once they started offering it to customers. And then at Airbnb is actually something like 50% of new travelers came through just word of mouth, and 70% of new hosts came through word of mouth, and essentially continue that way to this day. So this is a really interesting lever that before this work I hadn't even thought about, that a lot of marketplaces found that their supply drove their demand. So for example, DoorDash brings a restaurant on board. Then the restaurant has stickers and flyers and emails to their customers telling them, hey, if you want to order from us at home, go download DoorDash and order from us. And then you sign up for DoorDash, and now you're a DoorDash customer, and then you discover other restaurants. So the more restaurants they bring on, the more customers they end up finding. And Etsy, kind of the same. Actually, Etsy was the same thing. They found that their sellers just kind of did their own marketing for their own listings on Etsy, going to craft fairs and things like that. And then Eventbrite had a different mechanic where event creators created an event, sent the invite to all of their contacts, and then the contacts heard about Eventbrite and used it. The third most common lever, SEO. This was huge for Thumbtack. About 80-90% of their growth came through SEO. And super cool story of how they got into that I won't get into now. Grubhub also SEO. About 30% of their users, their number one lever, came through SEO. And then PR, an interesting one that I didn't expect, but it was actually really big for a few companies. For 6 of the 17, for TaskRabbit, basically it was word of mouth and press. And then for Zillow, it was the same thing. PR was one of their biggest growth levers early on. And so those are the 4 steps: constraining, concentrating, supply, and demand. And so let me just check the time. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes. So let me go through a couple of these and then I'll save a little bit of time for questions at the end. So you've kickstarted your marketplace, you've kind of got supply and demand growing and working. And then eventually you got to think about, how do we scale this thing? It's working. How do we scale? And there's 4 questions that I often get from founders around the scaling phase. How do you know if you're supply or demand constrained? What levers work at scale? We talked about the early growth levers, but what works later on? How do you keep quality in your marketplace? And then what would you do if you did it all over again? So first of all, how do you know if you're supply or demand constrained? This is how the companies I looked at broke down in terms of whether they were always supply constrained from day one and ongoing, whether they were always demand constrained, or if they're somewhere in between and independent. And so about 40% always supply constrained, 20% were always demand constrained, and the rest were somewhere in between. So on the supply constraint side, DoorDash essentially found they're always supply constrained, that the more supply they bring on, the faster they grow. And the reason for that, again, is their supply drove their demand. Uber and Lyft, same thing. They found that people could always use faster, cheaper rides. And so the more supply they bring on, the more people use it. And OpenTable, same thing, found that they had to stay with supply. On the demand constraint side, TaskRabbit, just like at the beginning, they basically found people really connected with their value prop of very flexible, meaningful income. And so they actually had to add a wait list and charge a fee for applying to become a rabbiter. I don't know what they're called. And then on the last bucket, which is it depends, basically every company figured out some heuristic or model that told them if they were supply or demand constrained. So at Thumbtack, they basically found that if they had less than 3 results for a search for a specific category in a location, that customers ended up being much less successful. So their goal and their North Star was essentially 60% of results having at least 3 or more results. So that's something to think about. Is there an inflection in your conversion if you have some number of results? So that's one way to approach it. Grubhub, their approach was they looked at essentially the number of orders per restaurant in a market, and that helped them prioritize which markets needed more supply if the number of orders per restaurant was in the higher percentiles of all of their markets, because they just said there's so much demand and these restaurants maybe can't keep up. And then Airbnb, we went through a number of phases, but essentially occupancy rate was how we thought about it. Are we supply constrained or demand constrained? If occupancy rate in a market exceeds some percentage, that means we're supply constrained in that market. And that was good enough for a while. And then eventually the team built an econometric model that essentially predicted for each unit of new supply or demand, how much revenue do we think this will drive to the business? And it told you which side is more valuable. But that took years to get down. And there's a fun story from Uber where they were trying to figure out how to balance the sides of the marketplace. And one of their GMs essentially invented surge pricing by just hacking it together and letting drivers know, if you drive on, I think it was Friday night, we're just going to double your earnings. And it worked really well. And so then they productized it. So it's kind of a good reminder. Just try finding ways to shift the balance where you can, even if it's hacky. And then I'll probably finish on this section, what growth levers work at scale for companies. Here are the 8. So there's only 8. That's one of the learnings here is once you're at scale, the number of levers you have at your disposal to drive growth is much fewer. And this actually combines supply and demand just to keep it simple. So that's one, there's fewer levers at scale. And then two, companies ended up using many of these. So if you remember, the median number of levers companies used early on was about 2. Here, I think it becomes 3. So eventually people layer on every possible lever they can. So that's the second takeaway. The third is that there's 2 new levers here that didn't exist in the early stages. Expanding geographically, which became a really important lever for a lot of companies that are location based, and then conversion becomes a really powerful lever later on, not early on. And then also performance marketing. Isn't that interesting? It was way at the end in the early stages, and now it's by far the biggest, most common growth lever for all these companies. So I just talked about all that. So yeah, at Uber, 50% of their growth these days is from paid. And at Zillow, they started doing paid down the road and ended up being a huge lever for them. Expanding geographically ends up being a huge lever for companies like Instacart. Is basically their biggest lever. Just add new cities. Same for Grubhub. And then conversion optimization, again, a new lever that comes later at Etsy, ended up being a huge lever. At Airbnb, I didn't include it here, but was also a big lever. And then at Zillow. SEO, we're not going to go through this, but SEO becomes more and more powerful for companies. And then referrals continues to stay really effective. So at Uber, 15% of their users still come from referrals. At Airbnb, it's about the same. And an important lesson here is at scale, there's no silver bullets that are going to, take off, accelerate your growth forever. It's a lot of lead bullets. And so don't ever think that there's going to be this one magical solution. It's essentially just continuing to add more growth levers and layering them on. So let me stop there and let me show you. You can go to URL and see this whole deck for yourself, because I know I went through it relatively fast. There it is. So that's the link if you want to check it out yourself. And then I'm going to stop sharing. There it is. It's just kickstarting marketplace. And then I'm going to look at questions. Alrighty. Okay, here we go. Let's read some questions. Is there a basic trend from all the interviewers after starting in the constrained market when it's time to approach more cities, for example? Yeah, I didn't go too deep into that, and it's such a good question of like, when do you start to expand to new markets? And I think the broad answer is once you've figured out a way to do it. So once you've kind of got some kind of playbook that tells you how to do it, and I think the way most companies approach it is start in one market and then test an additional market, and through that start to collect the playbook of how to do it. And then obviously a lot of stuff goes wrong, and then you learn from that and then try again. But I guess a simple way I think about it is you want to find product market fit or something that's working in that first market, because otherwise you're just going to be lighting more fires in your company by having many markets that are not working. So essentially get to a place where it feels like, oh yeah, maybe this is working, and then just try one more market. So someone asked if this differs B2B and B2C, and it definitely does. And unfortunately, these are all B2C marketplaces. And the reason for that is when I did this work, there weren't really many B2B marketplaces, and there's more and more now. And so I definitely want to do one of these looking at B2B. But I think a lot of this is still being figured out in B2B markets. But I'd say, if anything, sales just becomes even more of a lever in B2B marketplaces. I imagine most growth is going to come from that. Let's see. So what are the most common ways to incentivize supply to create content if you're creating a social network? Okay, I don't have a great answer to that, so I'm going to skip that. And then maybe one more question. Can seasonality impact the side of the marketplace you focus on based on time of year? Absolutely. It's a really important point. You want people to want what you're selling, and if seasonality is counter to what you're doing, you should figure out maybe a way to get around that, whether it's wait or find a different value prop during the off season. But on the other hand, when it is the season, you should see much more demand. So it should be a benefit if you can wait for that point. So I would turn that disadvantage into an advantage if I can. And then do you think, someone asked, do you think Patreon couldn't become a marketplace and Twitch did manage it? I think it's going to be really hard. I think the question is, are you solving a problem? And I don't think people are looking for more people to pay money to. So I think it'll be hard for them. And I think Substack's the same way. No one's looking for newsletters to subscribe to. It's like not a real problem for most people. And so, so I don't think marketplace model makes sense there. Cool. That's it. Hope that was informative. I'm just at Lenny-san on Twitter, and the deck is online. And so thank you.